The last countdown. The snow fell thick and silent, muffling the sounds of the town below as I trudged up the hill toward the old clock tower. The invitation in my pocket, written on coarse parchment in an elaborate, spidery script, promised an unforgettable New Year's Eve celebration. It had been waiting for me in my mailbox, unsigned and delivered without a postmark. I should have ignored it. The clock tower loomed against the night sky, its pointed spire vanishing into a veil of clouds. It had stood on the hill for centuries, a relic of the town's shadowy past. My breath hung in the icy air as I climbed the winding path, the towering structure growing larger with each step. The door, an ancient slab of wood reinforced with wrought iron, creaked open as if expecting me. Inside, the air was stiflingly warm, thick with the scent of old varnish and iron. The cavernous room beyond was lit by dim sconces, their flickering light casting shifting shadows across the stone walls. A crowd of elegantly dressed revelers mingled beneath the vaulted ceiling, their laughter strangely muted against the rhythmic tick-tock of the massive clock above. "Welcome," a voice purred from behind me. I turned to see the host, a tall figure draped in a tailored black suit and wearing a featureless porcelain mask. The mask's empty eye sockets reflected the flickering light, giving the unsettling impression that it was watching me. "You've come at just the right time," the host said, their voice smooth and measured, like the ticking of a clock. Something in their tone unsettled me, but I smiled politely and stepped further into the room. The other guests, all impossibly beautiful and impeccably dressed, greeted me with polite nods, but quickly returned to their whispered conversations. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. I noticed the clock, a massive, intricately designed timepiece dominating the far wall. Its golden pendulum swung in perfect rhythm, each tick reverberating through the room like a heartbeat. The host clapped their hands, the sound sharp and echoing. "Ladies and gentlemen," they announced, "thank you for joining me on this most auspicious night. Tonight, we count down not just to a new year, but to a new beginning." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, but it felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. I glanced at the other guests, suddenly aware of their unnerving stillness, the way their eyes lingered too long on the host's mask. "Please, enjoy the festivities," the host said, their mask tilting as though smiling. "The countdown begins shortly." The air grew heavier as they spoke, and I could feel the rhythmic pulse of the clock vibrating through the floor. Something about the host's words felt wrong, as if there was a deeper meaning that eluded me. But before I could dwell on it, a waiter appeared at my side with a tray of champagne flutes. I took one, the cool glass steadying my nerves. The drink was sweet, cloyingly so, and left an unpleasant metallic aftertaste. Setting the flute aside, I wandered through the room, weaving between clusters of guests. Their conversations seemed stilted, their laughter brittle, as though they were performing a script. "Unforgettable," one man whispered to a woman with hollow eyes. "This year will be unforgettable." Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," she replied. "It always is." The pendulum swung, and the ticking grew louder. The lights dimmed suddenly, plunging the room into near darkness. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but the host's voice cut through the growing unease. "Let us begin," they said, their mask glowing faintly in the dim light. All eyes turned toward the clock, its face glowing eerily in the darkness. The hands moved with deliberate precision, ticking closer to midnight. The host raised their arms, their movements fluid and almost unnatural. "We gather here on the precipice of time, where the past and future converge. With each chime of the clock, we shed the old year and embrace the new." The crowd erupted into polite applause, though it felt forced. My unease deepened as the host's gaze, or rather the blank stare of the mask, seemed to settle on me. "Prepare yourselves," the host continued. "The countdown begins now." The room fell silent as the clock struck 11. A single chime echoed through the tower, vibrating in my chest. I looked around, expecting the crowd to cheer, but they stood frozen, their faces blank and unreadable. Then, one of the guests, a woman in a sequined gown, collapsed. It happened so quickly I almost missed it. She crumpled to the floor, her champagne glass shattering at her feet. A murmur of concern spread through the crowd, but no one moved to help her. Instead, they stood in eerie silence, their eyes fixed on the clock. "What's happening?" I asked a man beside me, but he didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on the clock's face. The host's voice rang out, calm and commanding. "Do not fear. This is as it must be." I stepped forward, my heart pounding, but before I could reach the woman, her body seemed to dissolve into shadow, fading into the floor as though she had never existed. I staggered back, my pulse racing. What the hell is going on? The clock chimed again, its second toll louder than the first. This time, a young man near the center of the room vanished, his form flickering like static before disappearing entirely. Panic surged through me, but the other guests remained motionless, their faces unreadable. "You see," the host said, their voice cold and detached. "The clock chooses. Each chime is a step closer to a new era, a new order." I turned toward the exit, but the door was gone, replaced by a seamless wall of stone. The windows, too, were no longer visible, the room closing in like a prison. The ticking grew louder, each beat reverberating in my skull. As the clock struck again, the room seemed to warp, the walls bending and twisting as another guest disappeared. I realized with chilling clarity that we were all prisoners of the countdown, and that when the clock struck midnight, none of us would be left. The room was a coffin, suffocating and alive. The clock's relentless ticking echoed in my chest, each beat driving a nail into my growing panic. With every chime, a life was claimed, the victim dissolving into shadow. By now, a dozen guests had vanished, and their absences left an unspoken horror lingering in the air. The remaining partygoers stood still as statues, their gazes fixed on the clock like moths to a flame. Their expressions were eerily serene, betraying none of the terror clawing at my own chest. I turned to the man beside me, a sharp-featured stranger with hollow eyes. "We have to do something," I said, my voice trembling. His eyes flicked to me, glassy and distant. "You can't stop it," he murmured, his lips barely moving. "It's always been this way." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. He turned away, his body stiff, as though my words didn't matter, or perhaps because he knew something I didn't. The clock chimed again, louder this time. The sound reverberated through the room, distorting the air like a heat wave. Another guest, a silver-haired woman draped in pearls, collapsed. Her body crumpled to the ground like a marionette with its strings cut. Before I could move, she too began to dissolve, her form unraveling into a swirling mass of black mist. The mist drifted upward, drawn toward the clock like iron to a magnet. As it disappeared into the mechanism, the golden pendulum glowed faintly, its light pulsing in time with the ticking. "What is this?" I shouted, spinning to face the host. They stood at the base of the clock, their porcelain mask gleaming in the dim light. The empty eye sockets seemed to pierce through me, their gaze colder than the winter wind outside. "This is the cost of progress," the host said, their voice calm, almost reverent. "The old must give way to the new. Time demands its tithe." "Progress?" My voice rose with disbelief. "You're killing people." "They are not gone," the host replied. "They are part of something greater now." Their words sent a chill racing down my spine. "You're insane," The host tilted their head, the mask catching the light in a way that made it seem almost alive. Perhaps, but you will see in time. The crowd murmured in eerie unison, their voices blending into a hollow chant. It was a language I didn't recognize, guttural and rhythmic, like the turning of ancient gears. I backed away, searching for an escape. The windows were gone, replaced by seamless stone. Even the grand chandelier above seemed distant, its light dimming as the clock claimed more lives. My eyes landed on the base of the clock itself, where gears the size of cartwheels turned in relentless motion. If I could stop it. The thought was cut short as another chime rang out, shaking the very floor beneath me. A man screamed, his voice strangled as he was dragged backward by an unseen force. His eyes locked onto mine as his body flickered and vanished, leaving only the echo of his terror behind. I stumbled toward the clock, weaving through the petrified crowd. My heart pounded as I approached the massive machine, its golden face gleaming with an unnatural light. The symbols etched into its surface shifted and writhed like living things, whispering promises I couldn't understand. The gears were immense, intricate, and impossibly alive. Their polished brass surfaces caught the faint glow of the pendulum, casting jagged reflections across the stone walls. As I reached the base of the clock, the air grew colder, charged with a static hum that made my skin prickle. I hesitated, my breath clouding in the icy air. What was I even hoping to accomplish? The clock was vast, ancient, and imbued with a power I couldn't begin to comprehend. But standing still was no longer an option. I reached for the nearest gear, my fingers brushing the cold metal. It pulsed beneath my touch, vibrating faintly as though acknowledging my presence. The ticking grew louder, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd and the host's dispassionate monologue. You cannot stop it. The host's voice was closer now, their masked form gliding toward me. Their presence carried a weight, a pressure that made the air around me thick and oppressive. Watch me, I snapped, wrapping my hands around one of the smaller gears. The clock resisted, the metal biting into my palms. My muscles strained as I pulled with all my strength, but the gear wouldn't budge. It turned relentlessly, grinding against my grip as if mocking my efforts. Foolish, the host said, their voice dripping with disdain. The clock does not yield to the will of mortals. Another chime echoed, and I turned just in time to see a young woman vanish, her scream swallowed by the pulsing light of the pendulum. The crowd's chanting grew louder, their voices blending into a deafening cacophony. Desperation surged through me, drowning out my fear. I grabbed a heavy iron rod lying among the machinery and jammed it between two gears. For a moment, the grinding stopped, the clock stuttering like a beast caught mid-step. The host's mask tilted slightly, a ripple of something like amusement crossing their posture. You think you can stop time itself? I didn't answer. The rod was holding, the gears groaning in protest as they struggled against the obstruction. The ticking faltered, uneven and erratic. But the clock wasn't done fighting. The machinery roared to life, the gears twisting and grinding with unnatural force. The rod snapped like a twig, the sound piercing the air. A jet of searing steam burst from the clock's base, forcing me backward. The host stepped closer, their voice cutting through the chaos. The clock demands its tithe, and it will not be denied. Midnight approaches, and with it, renewal. I staggered to my feet, the taste of copper on my tongue. My gaze darted to the pendulum, its golden light now pulsing like a heartbeat. Midnight was minutes away, and the clock's relentless hunger was far from sated. I needed a new plan, and fast. The remaining guests were staring at me now, their eyes hollow and distant, as though they no longer belonged to themselves. Their chant had reached a fever pitch, the ancient language echoing like a curse. Above it all, the clock ticked on, counting down to the moment I feared most. The air felt thick with malice, every breath a struggle against the crushing weight of the clock's relentless countdown. The golden pendulum swung faster now, its glow pulsing in sync with the monstrous ticking. The chanting guests, hollow and lifeless, formed a circle around me, their faces masks of detached reverence. The host stood before the clock, their porcelain mask tilted upward as if savoring the rising chaos. "The moment is near," they intoned. "Time must claim its final sacrifice." I wasn't about to let it be me. With no other option, I hurled myself at the machinery again, desperate to disrupt its rhythm. My hands burned as I grabbed a smaller gear, using every ounce of strength to twist it against its grinding neighbors. The clock resisted, its metal groaning like a living creature. "Stop!" the host commanded, their voice booming with a resonance that vibrated through my bones. I ignored them, my focus locked on the thrumming heart of the machine. Somewhere inside, hidden among the tangled mechanisms, lay the pendulum's anchor, a glowing orb pulsating with otherworldly energy. If I could destroy it, perhaps I could end this nightmare. I grabbed the iron rod I had broken earlier and plunged it into the gears. The clock shuddered violently, the ticking faltering. The chanting ceased, replaced by the host's low, menacing laugh. "Do you think time can be broken so easily?" they asked, their mask gleaming in the pulsing light. "It is eternal, immutable, and you are merely flesh." The floor beneath me trembled, cracks snaking through the stone as though the tower itself was rebelling against my defiance. The remaining guests turned their dead eyes toward me, their faces slack, but their bodies moving in unison. Slowly they began advancing, their arms outstretched as though to drag me into the clock's merciless maw. "Stay back!" I shouted, swinging the rod wildly. They didn't flinch. A chime rang out, its toll deafening. Midnight was seconds away, and the air itself seemed to boil, shimmering with heat and static. The cracks in the floor widened, revealing a yawning void beneath, where the machinery's shadowy tendrils writhed like living things. I spotted the glowing orb nestled deep within the mechanism, its light now blinding. Summoning every ounce of courage, I leaped onto the clock's base, climbing the slippery brass gears as they ground against one another. Each step sent a jolt of pain through my legs, but I pushed on, the orb's pulsating light pulling me forward like a beacon. "You cannot escape time," the host called after me, their voice calm, yet filled with an unshakable finality. "Its judgment is absolute." The pendulum's swing slowed, its golden light flickering like a dying flame. I reached the orb, its surface impossibly smooth and warm, and hesitated. A voice whispered in my ear, not the host's, but something ancient and insidious. "Do you think you can outrun the years? Destroy me, and you destroy yourself." For a moment, doubt paralyzed me. The void below seemed to stretch endlessly, promising oblivion. But the faces of the vanished guests, their silent, pleading expressions, flashed in my mind. They weren't gone. They were trapped, consumed by the clock's insatiable hunger. With a guttural scream, I slammed the iron rod into the orb. The light exploded, searing and blinding. The clock howled, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The pendulum stopped mid-swing, its golden glow extinguished, and the gears ground to a shuddering halt. The tower trembled violently, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling as the cracks widened. The void beneath me roared, its tendrils flailing wildly before disintegrating into ash. The host's mask fell to the floor, cracking into pieces. Beneath it was nothing, a void where their face should have been. They staggered backward, their once commanding presence reduced to a shadowy specter that dissolved with the clock's final breath. The chanting ceased. The guests collapsed to the floor, their bodies limp but breathing, as if awakening from a terrible dream. I stumbled down from the clock's base, my vision swimming, my ears ringing from the explosion. The tower's walls seemed to melt away, revealing the cold night sky and the distant twinkle of stars. It was over. Or so I thought. As I stumbled out into the snow, gasping for air, I felt a faint vibration beneath my feet. A sound followed, a familiar rhythmic ticking, faint but insistent, echoing from somewhere deep within the earth. The clock might have stopped, but time was never truly broken.